Welcome back again. Now we're on part 2 of the rich man and Lazarus. We will start this part of the study of the rich man and Lazarus with reminding ourselves of the question asked, was the rich man in hell, in the passage where it says that in hell he lifted up his eyes, he was in hell. And so our discussion today is to explain why that was not a episode where the rich man was in hell. Okay, we will start by presenting certain facts. First of all, this particular passage was written in the book of Luke. It was written during the time under the law. It was not during the New Testament. It was not a New Testament passage pertaining to the eternal destinies of the people in the world or the church. It was not teaching on people going to heaven and to hell. But this particular parable was among the parables that Jesus was teaching, that he was using to teach the Pharisees. The information in the parable is directed towards the Pharisees and the Jews. It was not pertaining to the church. There was no definition of moral righteousness as far as the rich man being a morally right man or wrong or sinner. Even Lazarus was not declared by the passage to be a morally right person who went to heaven because he was morally right. So that's not the point being made here about moral righteousness or having enough righteousness to get to heaven or to end up in hell. So these are facts here that we have to discuss. Also, the word hell in the passage actually goes back to the word Hades, which means the grave, where the rich man was in the grave and he was in the parable crying out from the grave. And also the parable says that Lazarus died and he went straight to Abraham's bosom. He did not go to the grave according to the parable. And also then we have to realize that Abraham's bosom is a very, very symbolic. It is symbolic of the relationship of the Jews, the relationship of the Jews to the righteousness of the faith of God, which Abraham represented. It was the relationship of Abraham to the Jews that is being here discussed. It is not the rich man's relationship to God or to heaven or hell. It's about Abraham. And so this is a highly Jewish text, a highly Jewish parable that gives a message to the Jews. It is not a parable that is dealing with morality or setting a standard for how people get to heaven or get to hell with whether or not they are righteous or not. It was in the Old Testament because the Gospels in the Gospels, Jesus was teaching under the Old Testament, and all of his references were pertaining to previous Old Testament laws and things that were in the Old Testament that the Jews should have known, and those were his references. And there were no references, Old Testament references, of hell and people going to hell. So this idea of the flame was, it talked about the flame and the torment. Now, if you look at the parable, it talked about the rich man and Lazarus. And so it was here discussing the Pharisees, which were depicted as the rich man, and Lazarus, who was depicted as the poor man, or the beggar who was outside begging. He was not inside, he was outside. He seemed not to have a right to be in there, but he's picked up here as a model, and he's used to show that the poor man was one who was he might possibly have been representing the Gentiles who were outside and the Jews who were inside, who were rich with all the prophets and all of the law and the commandments and everything. But they did not appreciate it. The Pharisees didn't appreciate it. So they, even though they were rich, they did not really value it right. And so therefore, this poor man who was outside, he ended up after death in the bosom of Abraham. We see that it is a switch between the position of the Gentiles and the Jews, whereas Abraham approved the Gentiles. The Gentiles become the seed of Abraham by faith.
Yes, the Lazarus was in the bosom of Abraham. This was a type of the New Testament church of the Gentiles who will be in the place of favor where the Jews should have been. In this,
the reason why we can say this is because if we will consider the source of this particular gospel, the source of this gospel is the gospel of Luke. Luke is the writer. And in Luke's writings, he tries to show the change of the position of the Jews who rejected Christ and the church who accepts Christ and becomes, by accepting Christ, they inherit the place of favor. And that's what Abraham's bosom represents, the place of favor here on earth among the people of God. That's the reason why when the rich man yells up to Abraham, he answers him back and calls him son, is because it's trying to show that this rich man was the Jews who are naturally the sons of Abraham, but who loses their place because they did not take their hour of visitation seriously. And so this is a heavy Jewish message to the Jews, but it also is a message to the Gentiles too, showing them that what happened. Remember now, Luke writes this after Pentecost, after he's filled with the Holy Ghost, and after he goes through Pentecost, and after he sees the God's hand upon the Gentiles, after he sees the Gentiles coming to be saved, and how that the church ended up being mostly Gentiles and the Jews were out. It is from this perspective that he receives the message of Jesus in this parable, and he interprets it as Jesus intended, because it was Jesus' aim to show the effect of the coming church on the Jewish situation. It was the effect of the coming church that Jesus was trying to show, that the Jews would be out and the Gentiles would be in. And Lazarus, who was the beggar on the outside, ends up on the inside. And the gulf is the separation of the distance between the Jews religiously and where the church is religiously. The church is in the bosom of Abraham, and the Jews are outside. And this is the reason why the rich man says, "Go to my brothers. I have 5 brothers." And because they had Moses, they had the law and the prophets. And that's the reason why Jesus responds and says, "You have Moses and you have the prophets." Who had Moses and the prophets? It was the Jews. It was Jews of the Old Testament who had Moses and the prophets, the synagogue, we had the law. They said they had all of that. And if they won't hear that, then they won't even hear one if they came back from the dead. And Jesus was one that came back from the dead eventually there. And the Jews still didn't believe him. And so this may have been partially a little prophecy of that situation. So, and when he talks about the flame, the flame, he talks about the flame. He's not talking about Lazarus being in hell, but the flame is what we may call the torture of the regret of the Jews. When he said, lifting up his eyes and he was in torment, that word torment is a Greek word that means regret, not suffering as in physical pain from fire. And he didn't say flames as if he was in a fire. That idea was only injected in there and was taken prejudicially because of the preconceived notion that there was that the rich man is in hell, which was actually came centuries after this passage was written. That idea only was injected and viewed by people after the medieval ages and after the doctrine of hell actually was sown into the church. But originally, it was speaking of the flame or the regret. There was a word, boso, that meant regret, and that's actually the torment there meant regret. And the flame was the situation of regret and the anguish of the distance between the Jew and their father Abraham. The regret, the loss, the feeling of loss. It's equivalent to the feeling of loss that they experienced in the parable of the wedding feast, where they were cast into outer darkness and experienced the feeling of loss and the weeping and the gnashing of teeth.
We have discussed this and presented this to explain to you how it is that the story of the rich man and Lazarus is not about hell and people going to fires and burning forever in hell. That is not the concept. That doctrine was not in the world when this parable was given by Jesus, but it is pertaining to the Jews and their lost place.